For the first part of Unit 3, we will turn to naturalism, a mode that shares commonalities with realism. Indeed, it was at one time called New Realism. And if you look up scholarship on naturalism, you'll find a debate among scholars. Some see it as very separate from realism, its own distinct literary mode. Others see them as very related. In particular, for this unit, we will focus on 3 short stories: Stephen Crane's The Open Boat, Jack London's To Build a Fire, and Charlotte Perkins Gilman, The Yellow Wallpaper. I'll also mention some details from Gilman's explanatory essay, Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper. Okay, as I said before, naturalism has been described as both a mode of realism and as a branching off from it. There are strong commonalities between naturalism and realism, and I consider naturalism as a mode of realism. For example, we can see that there's a strong commitment to the referential mode, an attempt to refer to and represent exterior reality. Like realism, naturalism relies on the belief that the purpose of literature is the accurate depiction of life's details. We see characters who speak like real people and an attention to environmental details. But realists and writers who adhere to naturalism disagree on 2 things. First, they disagree on what life's details consist of, and they also have different conceptions of man's relationship to his environment. With regard to the life details, naturalism features more often than not the lives of the poor and working class, struggling immigrants, and those who are socially outcast and marginalized. The characters that appear in regionalism inhabit life on the margins, but the characters associated with naturalism are even farther away from society than those marginal characters that we find in regionalism. In naturalism, the characters are outliers, to borrow a term used by the writer Mary Austin, whose characters live on the fringes. With regard to man's relationship to the environment, writers associated with naturalism underscore the ways that environment shapes the behavior and choices of humans. So sometimes students look at this term naturalism and they guess, well, these writers must be concerned with nature. That's not exactly correct. They are interested in nature, but it's more human nature. And when we say naturalism, they're also looking at what the environment is, whether it's a rural environment or an urban environment. In these stories, there is little to no free will that the characters have access to. Influenced by social Darwinism, the application of the theory of evolution to social relationships, these writers highlight the notion of survival of the fittest, and I'm sure you've heard that term before. We see characters who have little control and who succumb to societal and natural forces beyond their control. Typical of this mode is the idea that determinism will win out over free will. There's a diminished belief in the possibilities of the human spirit. Social circumstances and heredity trump human will and desire. Think about what this means as far as plot goes. If a character can't escape the trap of his or her own genetics or upbringing, if a character can't do much about the predicaments in which she or he is raised, then extraordinary things have to happen to the character to keep things moving along. This is why you will encounter characters fighting for their lives in extreme weather or circumstances. Let me sum up. In naturalism, you will encounter the indifference of the environment, an emphasis on survival, and to highlight this theme, writers put their characters in extreme situations, the absence of moral judgment. Writers depict, for example, prostitutes, not to criticize a lack of morality, but rather to demonstrate how social circumstances force women to make certain choices in order to survive. You will also encounter representations of instinct over intellectualism. Writers put characters in situations or conflicts where brute instincts emerge. And you'll also see an emphasis on narrative over character. In other words, writers focus on what is happening In London, we get a procedural kind of writing, how to build a fire, how to look out for streams, etc. Stories that are labeled naturalism have these traits that I've just described, but not all of them. Jack London's To Build a Fire is a story that can easily be described as an example of naturalism. Here, London focuses on the survival of the main character, who is not named. The location is also an extreme environment. He's in the Yukon wilderness on a day when it is 107 degrees below freezing point, a detail that appears on the bottom of page 1051. The man is alert to his surroundings, but he is overly confident in his ability to measure and comprehend the world around him. We see him constantly checking this time, calculating mileage and temperature, and numbering his resources. But this tendency to rely on learned human knowledge leads him to underestimate the severity of his situation and gives him a false sense of mastery over the natural world. London draws a strong contrast between the man and the dog, and I know for many of you, the dog will become your favorite character. The man, he tells us on page 1048 in the second paragraph, is without imagination. He is, we're told, quick and alert to his surroundings, but this did not lead him to meditate upon his frailty as a creature of temperature. In addition, we're told that the man was not much given to thinking. We're also told that his mind is empty of thoughts. London connects this to imagination. Part of the man's problem is not that he can't reason things out, but he is unable to envision himself as dying. Indeed, this possibility doesn't enter his mind until 6 pages into the story. The dog's mind is empty of thoughts too. He doesn't have the capacity for imagination, but he does have instinct. Motivated by instinct, the dog's reactions to cold and to the man are based on survival, and this becomes much more important in this extreme environment. We get a long passage about the dog's instinct on page 1049. The animal was depressed by the tremendous cold. It knew that it was no time for traveling. Its instinct told it a truer tale than was told to the man by the man's judgment. The dog did not know anything about thermometers. Possible in its brain, there was no sharp consciousness of a condition, such as was in the man's brain. But the brute had its instinct. It experienced a vague but menacing apprehension. Later, instinct motivates the dog. When he falls into the water, the dog instinctively knows to bite ice from its legs so it doesn't freeze to death. Instinct later saves him from the man who wants to kill him for warmth. In this extreme environment, instinct is more effective than rational or scientific thought. The man has other problems. He lacks experience of the cold. He is a newcomer to the Yukon and doesn't know cold. Neither his upbringing nor his ancestry has provided him any knowledge of this kind of cold, we are continually told by London. The dog knows. The man should have paid more attention getting to know that dog. Unlike instinct, knowledge is learned. This story demonstrates that not learning something can be fatal. Instead of heeding the advice from the old-timer at Sulphur Creek, and that's also a refrain, he doesn't listen to the old-timer, the man travels alone. But learning would not have been enough either in this story. In the second to the last paragraph, which starts on page 1057, London suggests the importance of imagination. And this happens as the man is freezing to death. He pictured the boys finding his body next day. Suddenly he found himself with them, coming along the trail and looking for himself. And, still with them, he came around a turn in the trail and found himself lying in the snow. He did not belong with himself anymore, for even then he was out of himself, standing with the boys and looking at himself in the snow. It certainly was cold, was his thought. When he got back to the States, he could tell the folks what real cold was. He drifted on from this to a vision of the old-timer on Sulphur Creek. He could see him quite clearly, warm and comfortable, and smoking a pipe. "You were right, old hoss. You were right," the man mumbled. In death, ironically, the man gains some control and comfort in his situation. He does this through imagination. London's description offers us a little solace, but only a little bit. In death, the man imagines being found, but the real winner is instinct, and the story ends with the dog going toward civilization. The dog survives, where the man does not. Stephen Crane's story, The Open Boat, also features an extreme environment in which men fight for their survival, a feature of naturalism. The story is based on Crane's own experience, as the author headnote tells us. Crane was on board the Commodore when it sunk off the coast of Florida on January 2nd, 1897. He published an article about his survival a few days later in the New York Press. He later turned this article into The Open Boat. So this is based on a real occurrence. Crane offers a panorama of natural forces against which the characters are pitted. They have to fight the overwhelming force of the sea and the frailty of the human body. Notice that the story's characters represent not necessarily individuals, but a variety of types that represent humanity. They are known by their occupations, which suggests different abilities. There's the cook, the correspondent or the journalist, the oiler, whose strength and brute force contrasts him to the injured captain who has experience and knowledge of the sea. In opposition to the men is an indifferent nature. The details provided remind readers that the natural world does not care one whit about them. So the gulls fly about them without a sense of their danger, and the shore is described as the lonely and indifferent shore, repeatedly. On page 1003, the correspondent thinks, "Nature did not seem cruel to him then, nor beneficent, nor treacherous, nor wise, but she was indifferent, flatly indifferent." This is the world of naturalism. We have a harsh environment where man means little. They're like ants. In face of an indifferent nature, the men still do battle against the sea, but they are alone. Notice that they never look for help from the heavens. Crane suggests this in the very first sentence of the story, which is on page 990. None of them knew the color of the sky. They don't know the color of the sky because they're not looking up. Looking heavenward to God will not lead to their salvation. They must keep their eyes on the task at hand. And instead of divine intervention, the men are the victims of fate, who is personified on page 996 as an old ninny woman who cannot do better than this. To underscore the role of fate rather than human will, Crane's story offers the ultimate irony. The strongest does not survive in this story. The oiler, the only character given a name, dies despite his strength. While naturalism invokes many of the characteristics of realism, we definitely see romanticism at work in Crane's story. We sense a developing brotherhood among the men that warms and comforts them, for example. Crane seems to be telling us there's a larger meaning in this experience, and we don't really get that sense in London's story that there's a larger meaning, maybe a little bit in that last paragraph, but not throughout the story. We detect that larger meaning in the refrain about the Legion soldier dying in Algiers. His earlier encounter with the story, the correspondent's earlier encounter with the story, left him cold and indifferent. As a child, it didn't mean anything that there was a soldier dying in Algiers. Yet when confronted with his own death, he feels empathy and connection with not only the soldier, but with all humanity. Experiencing tragedy and dire straits makes us more passionate, Crane seems to be saying. It has the potential to create empathy. This element provides a variation in naturalism. Crane offers a kind of remedy. Nature may be indifferent and not care, but individuals can care. We can imagine something else. Song and art can provide meaning in an indifferent world. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the last writer that we'll talk about today, isn't a writer of naturalism per se, but we detect similarities in sentiment in her short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. Like the man in To Build a Fire and the men rowing for their lives in the open boat, the woman in the Yellow Wallpaper is caught in a constrictive and threatening environment. Rather than the natural environment, Gilman places her character in a world where women are considered subservient to men. While the woman is comfortable in a material and financial sense, her social situation is dangerous. We see that Gilman is not a strict realist or naturalist in the influence of romantic literary traditions in her story. In particular, she uses Gothic elements. She doesn't live in a castle, but she does live in an ancestral home, which is isolated from town. There are also some indications of a haunting, but we're not sure what she's being haunted by. We get the sense that things are not quite right, and there's an overwhelming, pervasive, uneasy feeling in this story. The narrator also tells us that the house is beautiful, but the descriptions she offers suggest otherwise. The greenhouses, for example, are broken. The house is drafty and cold. The wallpaper in the bedroom has been ripped and hangs in shreds. Gilman employs these Gothic elements to highlight the condition of women in patriarchy. The woman's doctor/husband makes fun of her, something the narrator says one expects in a marriage. I don't think many of us expect that in a marriage. He patronizes his wife, calling her little goose and little girl, and even belittles what readers begin to suspect is mental illness. She cries all the time and exhibits signs of depression. Gilman's essay, Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper, reveals that she was writing from experience. Gilman most likely had suffered postpartum depression, and her narrator, who has just had a baby, also probably suffers from that. In transforming her personal experiences as a patient under S. Weir Mitchell, Gilman critiques much more than his rescuer, which was historically a prescription for women who suffered from nervous disorders. She extends her criticism to general attitudes toward women in patriarchy. There's more evidence of the doctor husband's patronizing behavior. Although she tells him she would prefer to sleep downstairs, he makes her sleep upstairs in the nursery, a location that emphasizes that he treats her like a child. Notice that the room she preferred had an outdoor access, for easy escape perhaps, and only one bed, which would require her husband to sleep elsewhere. It's very telling. These are clues that she does not want to be with her husband, and yet, as an unreliable narrator, she ignores them. You have undoubtedly noticed, too, that this nursery has some very unusual features. The windows are barred, and there are rings attached to the walls. The bed is also nailed to the floor. It sounds much more like a room for torture. In addition to confining his wife to a room she prefers not to stay in, the doctor husband prescribes what she should do each hour of each day. He tells her not to work or engage in any stimulating conversation, even though she believes it would do her good. The narrator repeatedly tells us that if she could just write, she would get better. On page 792, for example, she describes writing as a relief to her mind. And on page 794, she tells us that writing would relieve the press of ideas and rest me. Writing in the story becomes an attempt at self-discovery and a mode of resistance. She tells us that she did write for a while in spite of them, because she believes that congenial work with excitement and change would do me good, she tells us. But she has to hide her writing, even from John's sister, who is brought in to take care of the domestic duties. Including John's sister is an acknowledgement that patriarchy isn't just something men do to women. Women, too, can be complicit in patriarchy. Like Stephen Crane, Gilman also employs irony. For example, she mentions the 4th of July, and you can find that on page 795. By doing this, she underscores the narrator's own lack of independence. Gilman also uses dramatic irony. We, her readers, know the significance of the narrator's words and actions, but she doesn't. We understand that she is going mad and that the yellow smooches on her clothes are evidence that she has been rubbing against the pattern on the wall. In fact, she becomes the woman who's trying to escape the wallpaper. When madness overtakes her in the end, the narrator finally gains a measure of control in an ironic way. She escapes while her doctor husband lies helpless on the floor after fainting. Much of what happens in this story is interior and hallucinatory. Nonetheless, we can see the story as an example of the realist mode and one influenced by naturalism. Gilman exposes the problems inherent in confining women in domestic spaces and in domestic roles. This is not just a story about an illness and acts instead as a metaphor for confinement and the social inequality of women.